All right, let's start. So hello, everyone, and welcome to the fourth lecture series at the Israeli Forum of Early Medieval Studies. I am delighted to open the semester. We have an exciting plan ahead of us for wonderful speakers. For further details about the series, you will find the forum's plan, which should pop in the Zoom's comment section anytime now. I wish to remind you all that the session and the following discussion are being recorded and will be uploaded to the forum's Facebook page, YouTube channel, and Instagram account. We also advise you to follow us on social media to receive the latest updates. Before I introduce the speaker of the day, I wish to thank, on behalf of Shachar Wolinsky and myself, all those who took part in making the series what it is. First and foremost, we wish to thank our speakers. So the forum was founded in early 2020, and our aim was to overcome the difficulties of COVID-19 and create a digital platform for early medieval academics to meet and to listen to the world's leading scholars. We could have only hoped that you would agree to participate, and we are excited to have you and hear your talks. Also, we wish to extend our gratitude to Professor Yitzhak Chen, the head of the Israel Institute for Advanced Studies, for his support and advice on both academic considerations and bureaucratic issues. Lastly, we thank you, our audience, for participating, commenting, and asking questions, and we hope you'd find this series more intriguing than ever. Now, may I introduce the speaker of the day? Professor Andrew Cain is a professor at the Department of Classics at the University of Colorado at Boulder, specializing in the Greek and Latin literature and the classical tradition of late antiquity. Between 2018 to 2022, Professor Cain served as the editor-in-chief of the Journal of Late Antiquity, and since 2019, he also serves as the associate editor of the Vigiliae Christiania. He was awarded the College Scholar Award in 2017. He is 4 times recipient of the GCAH Visiting Speaker Grant and twice the recipient of the Loeb Classical Library Foundation Grant. Professor Cain has edited 9 books and single-handedly wrote 8 books. His latest project, now under submission, is called Athanasius' Life of Anthony, a commentary on the Greek text with an introduction, text, and translation. Also, Professor Cain wrote the Greek Historia monachorum in Aegypto, Monastic Hagiography in the late 4th century, which came out with Oxford University Press in 2016, and for which he received the Eugene M. Caden Book Award. And also with Oxford University Press in 2009, he published the Letters of Jerome, Asceticism, Biblical Exegesis, and the Construction of Christian Authority in Late Antiquity, which gained him the Provost's Faculty Achievement Award. Today, Professor Cain will talk about Rufinus of Aquileia's Ecclesiastical History and Historia monachorum in Aegypto, a combined program of monastic historiography and hagiography. We will have time for questions after the talk. If you have a question for Professor Cain, please send me a message with your name and I'll ask you to present your question. And Professor Cain, thank you for agreeing to be here. The floor is now all yours.
How do we get so that it's just the full screen? I guess we can just keep it like this. Well, before I bring up my PowerPoint. Well, hi everyone. Thank you very much for coming. Thank you more for helping me set up the tech right before, and for that very, very kind introduction. I'm very grateful for that. I also want to thank the Israeli Forum of Early Medieval Studies for the very kind invitation to participate in this wonderful lecture series. And again, I want to thank everybody who is tuning in today from across multiple time zones. I was telling Moore right before we started that if there's one good thing that came out of the pandemic, it's this kind of technology that we're all able to be together. Even though it's probably close to bedtime for some of you, it's breakfast time for me here. That's a very neat thing. But I also want to say it's a real honor and pleasure to be with you today to share some of my recent research. My talk today arises from a long-time interest in the hagiography about the earliest Christian monks of Egypt. And in particular, 4th century classics like Athanasius's Life of Antony and the anonymous Greek Historia monachorum in Aegypto, and also Rufinus of Aquileia's Latin translation of that, which I'll talk about today. And this talk also intersects with one of my current book projects, which is hopefully going to be a somewhat radical reassessment of Rufinus's literary output and its overall significance to the patristic canon. I do want to give a small apology in advance if some of you may have already heard some of these ideas before, but they're still kind of in process. So I look forward to getting some feedback. Okay, let me now share my screen and begin my slides. So something that you'll notice is I do this when I teach as well. I use lots of colors in my PowerPoint slides. Hopefully none of the colors are too vivid and will burn your eyes. But in any event, so I wanted to start with this slide, my title slide. I took this photo a little over 5 years ago from the Hebrew University campus. So I wanted to make that my title slide for that reason. And also, it's a nice coincidence that Hebrew University is hosting this series of talks. But this photo is also very apropos for another reason. As I put beneath the photo, of course, this is the Mount of Olives, and this was the site of Rufinus's monastery in the late 4th century. We don't know exactly where on the Mount of Olives the monastery was, but it was somewhere there. And this photo is also nice because if you do a Google search for Rufinus of Aquileia, you will not find any medieval iconography, no nice Renaissance paintings like you get for people like Augustine and Jerome. There's a very basic reason for that. Rufinus, unlike those other two, he was never formally sainted, and he also therefore did not have any kind of cult that grew up around his legacy after his death. Okay, well, without further ado, let me begin my talk. So as a literary figure, Rufinus was a late bloomer. In fact, it wasn't until 397, when he was in his early 50s, that he evidently made his formal debut. But for the next decade and a half, until his death around 411, he steadily produced a large and diverse portfolio consisting of a few mostly smaller original contributions, plus a much larger set of translations of Greek patristic works by people like Origen, Eusebius, and others. He completed all of this translation work after returning to the West in 397. For almost 2 decades prior to this, he had lived in Jerusalem and served as abbot of a monastery on the Mount of Olives, which was part of a larger monastic complex that he established jointly with the senatorial widow Melania the Elder in the early 380s. The Greek works that Rufinus translated run the topical gamut, from biblical commentaries and homilies to ecclesiastical history and monastic hagiography. Now, representing this last genre category, monastic hagiography, is one of the shining jewels in his crown as a translator, the Historia monachorum in Aegypto, which I will call HM for short. That will actually shorten the talk by about 5 minutes, me using that abbreviation, by the way. The Greek original on which it's based, entitled, in fact, let me put to the next slide here. The Greek original on which it's based, entitled Heikat Aegypton ton monachon Historia, records a journey that's 7 months from Rufinus's monastery on the Mount of Olives made throughout Egypt between September of 394 and early January of 395. And during this time, they visited numerous monks and monastic communities from the Thebaid in the south to the delta town of Diolkis in the north. Following the party's return to Jerusalem, one of them, whose identity remains a mystery to this day, wrote up the journey in the form of a first-person trip diary. Now, this Greek text and Rufinus's Latin translation of it went on to become among the most influential and widely read works of Christian hagiography in late antiquity and the Middle Ages. Rufinus's HM is unique among his surviving works because it's his only known experiment with monastic hagiography. And so it's worth asking what prompted him to translate the Greek original in the first place. In a recent article, I tried to offer a partial answer to this question. I first showed that Rufinus made certain additions to the Greek original that depict the Egyptian monks as mouthpieces of the ascetic mysticism of Evagrius of Pontus. In particular, Rufinus often augments a monk's discourse to infuse an Evagrian element that may not already be present in the Greek. An excellent example is the following passage from his account of John of Lycopolis's discourse on pure prayer. He says, "It is the monk's chief occupation to offer pure prayer to God while having nothing blameworthy on his conscience. If, as I said earlier, we stand before God with a clean heart and are free of all the vices and passions I mentioned earlier, we will be able, insofar as this is possible, even to see God and to direct the eye of our heart toward him while we pray, and to see him who is invisible with the mind, not with the body, and with the perception gained through knowledge, not with the flesh's faculty of sight. For let no one imagine that he can gaze upon the very essence of God in and of itself, such that in his heart he would devise for himself some appearance or image that is similar to some corporeal image. In God there is no form, no limitation, but only perception and thoughts. Although he certainly can be perceived and can arouse the mind's feeling, he nevertheless cannot be apprehended or described or captured in words. Therefore, it's necessary to approach God with all reverence and fear and to focus the gaze of our mind on him so that the human mind, whatever all it can conceive of that is bright, that is splendid, bright, effulgent, and majestic, may always realize that he is above all these things. As I have said, this is the case if the mind is pure and not enslaved to any filth of a depraved intention. Therefore, those who seem to renounce the world and follow God are duty-bound to devote their utmost attention to this, just as it is written, "Be still and know that I am God." If he knows God, insofar as it is possible for a human being to know him, then he will acquire knowledge about the remaining things which exist and will learn the mysteries of God. The purer his mind is, the more things God reveals to him and shows him his secret counsels. Now, virtually none of this passage, which is fairly lengthy, virtually none of it is reflected in the Greek original. What Rufinus gives us is essentially a grab bag of Evagrian teachings on ascetic mysticism and epistemology. Pure prayer is the foundation of the monk's life and can only become possible once he has achieved impassibility. And it's also the meditative means by which he acquires progressive knowledge of God and the cosmos. Yet, while God is quote unquote perception and thought, sensus et mens, the finite mind is incapable of fully knowing him in his infinitude. The praying mind, therefore, must approach him humbly and reverently and resist the temptation to imagine him in reductive anthropomorphic terms, for he is a purely immaterial being without form or shape. So this passage is just one example among many in which Rufinus retouches the Greek original to favorably reflect Evagrian style spirituality. This makes sense when we consider Rufinus's relationship with Evagrius. Evagrius was in fact his longtime spiritual mentor, and he kept in close contact through correspondence with Rufinus's monastery in Jerusalem. Prior to leaving Jerusalem for Italy in 397, Rufinus had transformed his monastery on the Mount of Olives into a hub for disseminating Evagrius's writings at home and abroad. And he employed his monks, who occupied themselves in their cells with copying texts, as the frontline workers in this cottage industry. After he had returned to Italy, and especially after after he'd returned to Italy in 397, and especially after Evagrius's death in 399, Rufinus continued to act as a publicist and apologist for Evagrius's writings. This desire to popularize the core principles of Evagrian asceticism, I think, was one of the main driving forces behind Rufinus's composition of the HM around 403. But today I'd like to explore Rufinus's authorial intention from a different angle, and specifically in the context of his work as a church historian. This aspect of his work is represented most famously by his translation and continuation of Eusebius of Caesarea's Greek ecclesiastical history, which Rufinus completed around 402. There's a tendency among scholars to compartmentalize Rufinus's literary output and to see his work as a church historian as distinct from his writings that fit into other genre categories. I would like to push back a little on this tendency and see his church historiography as actually intersecting organically with his writings as a monastic propagandist. In particular, I'll argue today that he envisaged the HM as a follow-up or companion piece to his continuation of Eusebius's ecclesiastical history, and that he intended both of these writings to articulate together his vision of the monks of Egypt as prime movers in the Christianization of the 4th century empire. Throughout most of his adult life, Rufinus had a deep admiration for the world of monastic Egypt. He also had a close personal connection to it. For a period of around 7 years during his late 20s and mid-30s, he lived in Egypt and divided his time between Alexandria, where he studied scripture under Didymus the Blind, and the monastic establishment at Nitria, which lay 60 miles to the south of Alexandria. During his frequent and prolonged stays at Nitria, Rufinus forged long-term associations with many of its monks. It probably was also in Nitria that Rufinus befriended the senatorial ascetic widow Melania the Elder, with whom he would go on to co-found, around 380, a monastic complex on the Mount of Olives. Despite being based in Jerusalem for almost the next 2 decades, he remained in contact with monks at Nitria via correspondence, and he also periodically sent some of his own monks down there for extended stays. But in 397, Rufinus left Jerusalem, and he never again would return to the east. For the next decade and a half, he, until his death in 411, that is, he spent most of his time in Italy, variously in Rome, Aquileia, and the monastery of Panetum near Terracina, between Naples and Rome. Even after he relocated to the west, his fascination with monastic Egypt remained strong, as we can infer from the many glowing mentions that he makes of it in his literary works. A case in point is his translation and continuation of Eusebius's ecclesiastical history. Now, in translating Eusebius's work, Rufinus made substantial alterations to its content and structure. Most dramatically, he compressed the 10 books of the original work into 9, and then added his own 2 books, which pick up where Eusebius had left off in the year 324. And these books continue down to the death of Theodosius I in 395. Naturally enough, the people and events covered in these final 2 books reveal Rufinus's historiographic sensibilities and priorities. For example, he devotes quite a bit of space to praising the heroics of the Nicene Christians who held down the fort of orthodoxy against the Arians. More significantly for our purposes here, Rufinus also pays considerable attention to the birth and development of Christian monasticism. And in doing so, he securely fixes Egypt as the world's monastic center of gravity. In fact, throughout his narrative, he incrementally builds the case that the stars of Egyptian monasticism even spearheaded the Christianization of the 4th century Roman Empire. The Egyptian monks we meet in the final 2 books of the ecclesiastical history are larger than life historical actors. Many are acclaimed miracle workers, and Rufinus even explicitly puts some on a par with the biblical apostles, in keeping with his notion that in the broader sweep of salvation history, there's an unbroken continuum between God's people in the Bible and the successive generations of Christians after the New Testament. He thus notes that Paphnutius performed signs and wonders equal to the ones worked by the apostles, and he relates that Moses the Ethiopian achieved great fame on account of the miracles that God worked through him. But the monks of Nitria, whom Rufinus personally knew well, are painted in even brighter hues. For instance, in one passage he says of them, "At that time, those of Anthony's disciples living in Egypt, and especially in the desert of Nitria, who on account of their life and advanced age were considered to be the fathers of the monks, were Macarius, Isidore, another Macarius, Heraclides, and Pambo. They were held to be companions in the lives and deeds, not of other mortals, but of the angels on high. I speak of what I was there to see, and I report the deeds of those whose sufferings I was granted to share. Elsewhere in Book 11, Rufinus gives the following anecdote about Antony encouraging Didymus the blind to keep up the good fight of the faith. Rufinus says, when the blessed Antony was on his way down to Alexandria from the Thebaid to bear witness against the Arians with the faith of Athanasius, he consoled Didymus with these marvelous words. Didymus, don't be troubled by the loss of your physical eyes, because what you lack are those eyes which mice, flies, and lizards have. Rejoice instead that you have the eyes which angels have, by which God is seen, and through which a great light of knowledge is being lit for you. Right after this, Rufinus again emphasizes his own personal connection to the luminaries of monastic Egypt, and thereby he cites his eyewitness credibility as an historian. He says, Egypt was flourishing at that time, not only with men steeped in Christian learning, but also with those who lived throughout the vast desert and performed apostolic signs and wonders in simplicity of life and sincerity of heart. The ones of them whom we ourselves saw and by whose hands we were worthy of being blessed are Macarius of the upper desert and another Macarius of the lower desert, Isidore in Skete, Pambo and Kellia, Moses and Benjamin in Nitria, Ischirion, Elias, and Paul in Apeliotes, another Paul in Phoci, and Poimen and Joseph in Pispir, which was called Antony's Mountain. We learned as well from a reliable report that a great many other men of this kind lived in Egypt, such that the apostle's statement truly was fulfilled. Where sin abounded, grace abounded far more. Around the same time, Mesopotamia also had noble men who excelled in the same way of life. Some of them we ourselves saw in Edessa and Carrhae, while we heard about even more of them. Elsewhere in Book 11, Rufinus stresses that the monks of Egypt don't operate in the vacuum of their own self-imposed desert seclusion, but are proactive about using their charismatic authority to shape current events in the secular sphere. For example, he says that the Emperor Theodosius treated the hermit John of Lycopolis as his own personal oracle and consulted him on important military decisions which had empire-wide import. He says, Theodosius was angered and prepared to take up arms in revenge against Eugenius, who had succeeded the one who had died. But first he sought God's will through John, the monk we mentioned earlier. He was the one who had foretold to him the previous bloodless victory over Maximus. This time he promised another victory, but not without great bloodshed on both sides. Now, around 403, a year or two after completing his ecclesiastical history, Rufinus finished another major translation project, his HM, which gives us a diverse portrait gallery of some 36 distinguished 4th century Egyptian monks. In it, we observe a continuation and significant elaboration of the above discussed running themes of the last 2 books of his ecclesiastical history. Like he does in the ecclesiastical history, Rufinus systematically casts the monks of Egypt as successors to the biblical prophets and apostles. And he does so by using the narrative technique of typological figuration, a technique employed routinely by early Christian hagiographers across the board. Now, typological figuration in hagiography falls under 2 basic headings. So on the one hand, there is direct typology, in which the saint is explicitly compared to a named biblical person, or when that saint is called a biblical prophet or apostle. So that being obviously a clear allusion to the Old Testament prophets and New Testament apostles. The other kind of typological figuration is indirect typology, in which the comparison to a biblical person is implicit and not overtly spelled out. So in other words, there are allusions that are being made, and the reader is left to connect those proverbial dots. Now, Rufinus applies direct typology to several individual monks, such as Apollo of Boet, who he says was revered by all, quasi propheta aliquis aut apostolus, as if he was some prophet or apostle. Elsewhere in his treatment of Apollo, Rufinus again portrays this monk as being like a biblical prophet or apostle, but this time he has Apollo himself proclaim this in his own voice. After Apollo performs a miracle of bread multiplication, the devil taunts him about presuming to do things only the great figures of the Bible could do. And Apollo replies, quote, "Why do you say that? Were not the apostles and prophets men who bequeathed to us their faith and grace? Or was God present then, but now is absent? God can do anything, and what he can do at any time." Rufinus also implies indirect typology to depict the Egyptian monks implicitly as biblical figures. Apollo of Boet, again, is a useful example of this literary phenomenon. So he tells the following story that's you can see on your screen. During the reign of Julian, Apollo heard that a certain brother had been arrested over the issue of military service and was being detained in prison. He and the brothers visited him in order to lift his spirits and to remind him to hold fast in these dire circumstances, and also to think nothing of and laugh at impending perils. The time of trial is at hand, he said, and during it the hearts of the faithful are to be tested and exposed through temptations. As he was firming up the resolve of the young man with these and other words, the garrison commander showed up and was irate at how Apollo presumed to come in without permission. He had the prison's doors locked from the outside and imprisoned Apollo and all who had come with him, so that he could keep them for compulsory military service. He assigned several guards to them and left. In the middle of the night, an angel appeared before them, aglow with a dazzling brightness. As the guards stood dumbfounded and petrified, the angel threw open the doors of the prison. At that point, they fell at the feet of the holy men and begged them to leave, saying that they would rather die on their account than stand in the way of the divine power that was protecting them. In the morning, the garrison commander and his chief officers rushed to the prison and urged all the detainees to depart. The reason, he said, is that his house had been destroyed by a great earthquake and that every one of his most prized servants had died as a result. Upon hearing this, the holy men sang a hymn and praised God and retreated to the desert as one body, having, like the apostles, one heart and soul. This lively account draws from three different apostolic jailbreak narratives in the book of Acts. A group of apostles at Jerusalem in Acts chapter 5, Peter at Jerusalem in Acts chapter 12, and Paul and Silas at Philippi in Acts chapter 16. Contemporary readers who were biblically literate were expected to recognize these covert echoes and then to make a typological link between Apollo's cohorts and their biblical predecessors. In order to reinforce this connection, Rufinus concludes the story with an allusion to Acts 4:32, which reads, "Now the full number of those who believed were of one heart and soul." By bringing in this biblical intertext, he superimposes on Apollo's monks the same romanticized sense of holy solidarity that is said to have animated the earliest Christian community at Jerusalem. Rufinus credits the Egyptian monks with the same kind of profound transformative influence on the world around them that he attributes to them in the ecclesiastical history. Though it receives a much more focused attention in the HM. They exhibit their divinely bestowed restorative authority over the physical world in another important way as well, acting as new Adams who have achieved the communion with God that humanity had enjoyed prior to the fall. And by virtue of this, they've returned a sense of equilibrium to the cosmos, which humanity had essentially lost through original sin, according to the biblical account. The monks restore cosmic harmony partly by reinstating the horticultural conditions of prelapsarian Eden, for instance, by making lush vegetation spring up in parched sand, and thereby they reverse the original curse, according to which the earth would bring forth nothing but thorns and thistles to Adam and all of his descendants. They also exercise complete dominion over even the deadliest wildlife. banishing or killing hippopotamuses, crocodiles, and snakes. And therefore, they recapture, in a biblical typological sense, the sovereignty that God gave Adam over the fish of the sea, the birds in the sky, and every living creature that crawls on earth. What would have astounded contemporary readers, probably even more, are the many stories told in the HM about the Egyptian monks performing miracles that defy the laws of physics, such as walking on water, teleporting themselves to other places, multiplying loaves of bread, and even causing the sun to stand still. In the prologue to the HM, Rufinus sums up their wonder-working power and casts it in a biblical light. He says, I saw among these monks many fathers who live on earth, yet lead a heavenly life, as well as new prophets raised up for the cultivation of spiritual virtues and for prophesying. As a testament to their worthiness, they have the power to work signs and wonders, and rightly so. For why should those who desire nothing earthly and nothing fleshly not receive heavenly authority? So mighty is the faith within them, in fact, that it is capable of ordering mountains to be moved from their place. This also is how, by their prayers, some of them have stopped the flooding of the Nile when it threatens neighboring areas, and how they have crossed the deep parts of its riverbed on foot, and how they have slain its wild animals, and how they have performed countless more signs, which had been done in ancient times by the prophets and apostles. There should be no doubt that the world stands firm on account of their just actions. Now, in this passage, Rufinus affirms that the desert monks act as conservators of the human race. Even though they live geographically on the periphery of human civilization, virtually all of them are actively engaged in the everyday lives of men, women, and children who run the socioeconomic gamut, from Coptic peasant farmers who ask them to bless their land and make it grow crops, to military tribunes and senatorial aristocrats who humbly ask for healing miracles. In other words, the social reach of the monks' authority is universal. The Egyptian monks help people from all walks of life come to terms with the vicissitudes of everyday living by alleviating their physical pain and suffering. For instance, they cure cataracts, rabies, and other unspecified maladies, and they revive the comatose and exorcise demons. They also assuage people's concerns about the uncertain future. John of Lycopolis, who's the subject of the first and longest chapter of the HM, is a prime example. Rufinus says of him, the more he cut himself off from human concerns and interactions, the nearer and closer God was to him. In a word, he had made so much progress in purifying his mind that he not only received from the Lord the knowledge of things in the here and now, but he also was deemed worthy of the knowledge of things to come. For the Lord conferred on him an evident gift of prophecy, such that he foretold the future not only for any people from his own city and province who happened to make inquiries, but also he often foretold for the Emperor Theodosius, either the outcome of a war in which he was about to engage, or how he would prevail over enemy leaders, and also that he was about to endure invasions by barbarians. Finally, Rufinus depicts the Egyptian monks as healers, not just of the body, but even more importantly, of the soul. Like the biblical prophets and apostles to whom they're compared in the narrative, they occupy center stage in the unfolding drama of salvation history. In some cases, neophyte monks seek out senior monks and request to be their disciples because they're eager to attain quote unquote salvation, which is defined narrowly in these instances as the ongoing purification of the soul through ascesis. For most other people in the HM, however, salvation is dramatically portrayed as beginning at the decisive moment of a miraculous, instantaneous conversion, either to confessional Christianity or to the ascetic life. In fact, there are so many conversions in the HM, you could even call it a book of conversions. We could literally rename it that, and we would be just fine. It would accurately depict its contents. Now, the thematic overlap between Rufinus's ecclesiastical history and HM are abundantly clear by now, I think. His conceptual linking of these two works is illustrated also by revealing comments he himself makes in both of them. In Book 11 of the Ecclesiastical History, he concludes his story about Macarius's healing of some blind hyena cubs by telling readers that if we should wish to follow up on individual miracles, we will be prevented by our planned brevity, especially since these matters deserve to be narrated in their own work. And that's the passage on the left. Now, at first glance, he seems to imagine here something like a libellus of miracles devoted entirely to Macarius. But probably a year later, he in fact filled this gap that he was alluding to here in the form of a series of additional stories about Macarius that are embedded in the HM. So after relaying all of the stories, Rufinus explicitly cross-references the ecclesiastical history, and this is the passage on your right. He says, "But as we have said, many other astounding things are related about Macarius's deeds, and one who is curious about them will find some incorporated into the 11th book of the ecclesiastical history." This statement is, of course, a directive to readers to consult his ecclesiastical history. So Rufinus expressly treats the Macarian dossiers in the ecclesiastical history and the HM as being supplemental to each other. What is more, he gives only the title of the work in question as ecclesiastical history, but doesn't add a qualifier to specify whose ecclesiastical history it is. He assumes that readers of his HM will already have recognized that it is his church history. Such an assumption on his part makes sense if he intended readers to have both texts at their fingertips and envisaged them to circulate alongside each other, essentially as a bundled unit. This expectation would not have been unreasonable, given that he composed them in quick succession, and thus increased the likelihood that they could be disseminated together in the earliest stages of their transmission history. And we should also remember that when he produced both writings in the early 400s, he was back in Italy and had in place a network of well-placed Christian friends and literary patrons who could be instrumental in helping to disseminate his works. One of these people, in fact, was Chromatius, Bishop of Aquileia, who also, not coincidentally, had baptized Rufinus decades earlier. Rufinus's cross-referencing of the ecclesiastical history in the HM is one indication that he viewed both works as being interconnected, at least as far as their erytological material on Macarius is concerned. But we need not suppose that their symbiosis is confined to this one case. This just happens to be the case that Rufinus explicitly signals to readers. In fact, as we saw earlier, both works complement each other in placing the monks of Egypt center stage in 4th century history. Initially, at least, while wearing his hat as Eusebius's continuator, Rufinus may have chosen the HM as his next logical translation project, with the idea that it would serve as a companion piece to the ecclesiastical history. In essence, then, I'm suggesting that he conceived the HM as an elaboration of one salient thematic strand of the ecclesiastical history, which he felt deserved the kind of in-depth, sustained treatment that simply was not possible in the discursive, wider-ranging narrative of the ecclesiastical history, but that was possible in a monographic work like the HM. What would have made the conceptual pairing of the ecclesiastical history and HM seem even more appropriate, as I call the proverbial icing on the cake, is another common denominator. The word Historia appears in the titles of both works. The Greek abstract noun historia, that is its root, is related etymologically to an Indo-European verbal root, which means to see or to know, and entails the gathering of knowledge through autopsy, as well as the writing down of the results of these investigations. The word historia in Latin then implies a careful scientific-like inquiry, and its prominent place in the titles of the two works in question, in turn, not only suggests a shared literary and methodological pedigree, but it also implicitly lends a veneer of credibility to Rufinus himself as the purported eyewitness narrator. Rufinus took another important step in strengthening the impression that his HM is his own eyewitness account of the Egyptian monks narrated in its pages. Unlike the vast majority of the translations he produced, the HM lacks an original preface in which he names his dedicatee and announces the occasion and circumstances of the translation. Modern scholars have failed to notice how peculiar this absence is, but I think that something can be made of it. Now, the HM does, in fact, have a preface, but it's essentially a duplication of the Greek preface, in which the anonymous author tells us that he composed the work at the request of fellow monks at his monastery on the Mount of Olives. In rendering it into Latin, Rufinus does not update or retouch the Greek original with his own uniquely personal dedication, nor does he give any indication, as he does in his other prefaces, that the HM is a translation at all. The relevant portion reads, "Even though I am rather ill-equipped to write about such weighty matters, and even though it doesn't seem appropriate for those who are lowly and insignificant to become authors and to write about sublime virtues in a pedestrian style, nevertheless, because the charity of the brothers who live on the Holy Mount of Olives frequently urges me to describe the Egyptian monk's way of life, spiritual virtues, cultivation of piety, and the firmness of the ascetic discipline I personally witnessed in them, I shall proceed entrusting myself, as one who needs assistance, to the prayers of those who commission this, and not seeking praise for the composition, but hoping that readers will be edified by the narration of stories, inspired by the examples of the feats, is called upon to shun the world's enticements and to cultivate stillness in the practice of monastic holiness." Now, the author of the Greek version chose to release his writing anonymously, and that phenomenon is not exactly surprising because it's attested in at some moderate level throughout late antiquity, and other Christian authors, in fact, kept their identities a secret for any number of reasons. Rufinus, though, obviously knew who the author was, because several years earlier in the mid-390s, this man had been a monk in his monastery that he supervised. Nevertheless, neither in the preface nor in the body of the work does he divulge the monk's name by way of crediting him as author, nor again does he indicate in a separate preface that the HM is a translation. The reader then is left by default with the impression that the HM, preface and all, is Rufinus's own product, an impression that even some modern scholars have been under. I propose that this was precisely Rufinus's intention, and that he capitalized on the Greek author's deliberate anonymity in order to release the HM under his own name. In other words, ostensibly as his own writing. That Rufinus would not have hesitated to take such a liberty is suggested by his comment in the epilogue to his translation of Origen's commentary on Romans, that when he releases his translation of Pseudo-Clement's Recognitions, he will place his own name in the title alongside the putative author's name, so that the work will be known as Rufini Clemens, Rufinus's Clemens. What I am proposing in this case, in the case of the HM, is merely the next natural step. An interesting piece of primary source evidence sheds light on our problem. In a letter written around 414, Jerome spoke of Rufinus's translations of the writings of Evagrius of Pontus, and then referred disparagingly to the HM. He says a great many people eagerly read his, Evagrius's, books in Greek throughout the East, as well as in Latin in the West, thanks to translations made by his disciple Rufinus. The latter, that is Rufinus, also wrote a book that professes to be about monks, and he includes in it many who never existed, as well as ones whom he portrays as having been Origenists, and who certainly have been condemned by the bishops. I mean Ammonius, Eusebius, Euthemius, Evagrius himself, or Isidore, and many others whom it would be tedious to list. He placed at the front of the book itself one John, who was undoubtedly Catholic and a saint, so that by appropriating John in this way, he might introduce into the church the rest of the heretics he had put in there. So Jerome says that Rufinus, quote unquote, wrote the HM, and the verb scribere, taken in its natural sense, would denote an original composition. By contrast, in the previous sentence, Jerome employs the verb interpretare to characterize Rufinus's activities as a translator of Evagrius's works. The distinction suggests that he regarded Rufinus as the actual author of the HM, not merely its translator. This is why he goes on to accuse Rufinus of abusing his authorial license to manipulate the internal order of the chapters by placing the one on John of Lycopolis, an eminent 4th century Egyptian monk who was famed for his prophetic power. So by placing that chapter on him at the very beginning, in a bid to use this work as a literary Trojan horse for sneaking Origenist monks into the church's fold undetected. Jerome's testimonium, the part of it which ascribes authorship to Rufinus, has a certain prima facie credibility for two reasons. First, it dates to about a decade after the HM had been composed, and it is in fact the earliest independent witness to the contemporary transmission and reception of the HM. Second, Jerome was a very discriminating reader, especially when it came to the writings of his rivals. And we know for a fact that he kept very close tabs on Rufinus's output in the wake of their fallout during the so-called Origenist controversy of the 390s. How then could Jerome have been under the impression that the HM is an original Rufinian opus? The answer, according to my hypothesis, is straightforward. The Latin HM was circulating under the name of Rufinus, who for that reason was assumed to be its author. And as I suggested earlier, this was by Rufinus's design. But the inevitable question of motive remains. Why would Rufinus have engaged in the kind of attributional sleight of hand that I've proposed? So putting to the side his possible desire for literary recognition, I'd prefer to see here a sophisticated narrative strategy. In leaving his readers with the impression that he authored the HM, Rufinus aligns his own voice as translator with the voice of the anonymous monk behind the Greek original. He thus appropriates his author's eyewitness experience as his own. As far as the reader knows, he is narrating his own journey through Egypt, and more to the point, his own personal interactions with its 4th century monastic royalty. Had he openly presented the HM as what it really is, a Latin rendering of a Greek account of another person's firsthand experience, he would have been putting his readers at 2 removes from the Egyptian monks. But as the purported eyewitness himself, he becomes the sole intermediary between his readership and the legendary ascetics of the desert. This move had 2 important effects. First, Rufinus's authority as a monastic hagiographer is significantly enhanced, and the HM acquires a greater sense of authenticity. Second, the reader's vicarious experience of monastic Egypt, filtered through the lens of Rufinus's narrative, is rendered more vivid and direct. After all, the avowed purpose of the HM is spiritual edification. Rufinus's repackaging of it as his own firsthand account facilitates this function by fostering the illusion that his readers are interacting with the monks and receiving their very words directly from their source, except it's just through Rufinus's mediation and his mediation alone. So let me conclude with just a few wrap-up comments. Rufinus had several incentives, I think, for producing the HM. Because of its unique genre profile, it added some diversity to his existing portfolio of translation work. Because he had lived in Egypt for several years in the late 370s and early 380s, he had rubbed elbows with some of the monks profiled in the HM's pages and had developed a passion for their way of life. And so on this level, the HM can be read as a somewhat of a tribute to a decisive period in his own life and development as a monk. And as I discussed a bit at the beginning of the paper, he used the HM to disseminate in an entertaining and easily digestible way the principles of Evagrius's ascetic mysticism. But as I've argued today, Rufinus's work as a church historian provides another compelling clue to his authorial intentions. His Latin continuation of Eusebius's ecclesiastical history is the earliest historiographic account of the rise of Christian monasticism. And one of Rufinus's main objectives with this work was to depict the monks of Egypt as prime movers in the Christianization of the 4th century empire. Within a year or so, he also completed his HM, which gives an exhilarating account of some 36 stars of the Egyptian monastic movement of the 4th century. The timing of these two back-to-back projects was not coincidental, I suggest. As I've argued, Rufinus saw these two projects as complementary to each other and used both in tandem to create an engaging narrative of history in which the monks of Egypt occupy center stage and are emblematic of and even partially responsible for the 4th century empire's Christian turn. Thank you. Do a stop share
yes,
here.
please. Yeah.
There we go.
All right. Thank you very much for such a wonderful talk. I will open the discussion, if that is okay with you, with a question of my own. So I have in mind Augustine's City of God and Orosius's 7 books of history. And I was wondering if we perhaps consider both enterprises as somewhat similar. Maybe one of them took an example of the other one. And also I have in mind Gregory of Tours. So there was recently a book published by Dr. Tamar Rothman, who's here, I think, about Gregory of Tours, and she really claims that Gregory's Glory of the Martyrs and Glory of the Confessions is all a part of a wider factory or a phenomenon to create a world history. So I might think that maybe it is a wider phenomenon. Maybe maybe Rufinus had, I don't know, literary examples that he was following.
So yeah, thank you very much. He wouldn't have been following Augustine or Orosius because, of course, he was writing before them. But in his case, and I'm very glad you mentioned Augustine and Orosius, because on one level, both of them are engaged in the very same thing, right? This revisionist history of Rome, of Rome's long history, and essentially looking at Roman history as one long descent into a very bad place until Christianity comes along and then it becomes redeemed. And Rufinus very much is doing that in the last 2 books of the ecclesiastical history, because he spends a lot of time, and a lot of his anecdotes are devoted to how, for instance, within Egypt, all sorts of pagan temples are being desecrated now, although he considers it I guess you could say sanctified, right? They're being turned into Christian buildings, or their statues, pagan statues, are being torn down, and he revels in this. So one of the main aims of his continuation of Eusebius's history is essentially to do what Orosius and Augustine did on a much larger scale, and that's to provide a narrative, a very one-sided narrative, clearly, in which he revels in the political triumph of Christianity over paganism and its cultic activity. But of course, as we know, on the ground, it really wasn't this simple at all, that in fact, paganism, if you want to call it that, did not exactly die a quick and easy death, nor did it ever die a death at all, one could argue. So, you do have, in other words, some clear thematic, connection points between what Rufinus is doing and what Augustine and Orosius. And yeah, I'm aware of Tamar's book, and I've read some of it. I'm very much intrigued by that thesis, and like it very much. This notion that Gregory is actually, the Glory of the Martyrs, for instance, as you mentioned, is not simply a self-standing work that Gregory just wrote. It's part of a bigger agenda, a larger, broader literary agenda. And I think that certainly holds true for Rufinus, because if you look at all of his translation work, and he produced a lot of it, it's all done within about a decade. And it's a very, very impressive body of work by ancient standards, considering how many resources, just in terms of the scribal process, were needed for copying these things, for acquiring the books to begin with. He was extremely prolific, and I think that because all of these things were produced within about a decade, that increases the likelihood that Rufinus himself can draw convenient connections between some of these works, as opposed, well, even Augustine wrote the City of God over the course of many, many years, right? And it's even been argued that his thinking changes, it evolves over the years. So you can't, for instance, what he says in book 1 may not always jive with what he says in a later book, right? We have to leave some room for evolution in his thought. With Rufinus, we don't have to worry about that, thankfully, because he produced all of this stuff within a very short time. A question that I've always been perplexed by is why it took him until his early 50s to start doing this, but I guess that we'll never know. But in any event, thank you very much.
Thank you. Our next question is from Liu Bava.
Hello, thank you so much for the interesting presentation. I have 2 questions. First, are there any things in Rufinus' history related to the teachings of the Donatists? And second, is it known what source Rufinus used when writing history? Thank you.
Thanks. I'm sorry, I didn't hear the second question. There was a kind of a blip in the.
What source Rufinus used when writing history?
So yeah, in terms of the first question, so does he directly address the Donatists? No. No, he does not do that. So Augustine, obviously, to get back to Augustine, we rely on him primarily for this, or much more so than Rufinus. But in terms of when, did you say when did he compose the history?
I'm sorry, I repeat your second question, okay? Is it known what sources Rufinus used when writing his history?
Okay, thank you very much. Yes, so yeah, that's a great question. Well, Eusebius obviously was his source for the first 10 books. That goes without saying. But on that note, Rufinus also makes his own very interesting interventions, sometimes interspersing quotations from Virgil's Aeneid, for instance. And Michael Hannigan showed in a very interesting article published, I believe it was a couple years ago, how his treatment of a couple different scenes of anti-pagan scenes in the ecclesiastical history are drawing from classical sources. Now, those aren't historical sources, which I think you're asking about. So for some of this, Rufinus is going to be using, or what he claims to be his own eyewitness accounts. We're a bit in the dark about what literary sources he may have been using. Now, he does occasionally, he cites certain events that would have been known to somebody who lived through that time period, certain imperial laws that were issued and whatnot. So he would have had access to at least that, like any other person living in the empire. But he's somebody who he's writing at a period in which the writing of church history, at least on the Christian side, was still a very, very young venture. So you had Eusebius, who was the innovator here on the Greek side, one could argue. Rufinus, one could argue, is the innovator on the Latin side when it comes to this narrative style historiography. So we're several decades before, say, a Sozomen, right, or a Socrates, or so on. So again, we don't really have a lot of information on specific literary sources he might have been using, because they simply didn't exist, at least on the Christian side in Latin. So
Thank you very much.
Our next question is from Sabrina.
Hi, hello, Andy.
Hi.
I'm very glad to finally meet you face to face.
Yeah, likewise.
Thank you very much for your paper. It's a subject that is very dear to me. I have many questions, but for the moment, to let other people speak, I will restrict myself to only one. So as you probably know, I'm working on Jerome's De Viris Illustribus. And Jerome, he does something that is quite similar, in fact, to what Rufinus does, but in a very different way also when he writes this, because he also takes a strand that exists in Eusebius' Historia Ecclesiastica, and then he takes it out and he continues it also in Latin. It's also sort of a continuation somehow, although he presents Eusebius as his source and not as his model. In the end, what he does is to extract the literary catalog and continue it in Latin. And so I was wondering if you think there's a relationship between those two catalogs, and if Rufinus somehow, by doing things so differently and by taking a totally almost opposite way of doing collective biography, does he somehow answer to Jerome? Because Jerome doesn't get at all into anything that has to do with miracles and all that. He's very, very down to earth. He's talking about style, and the biographic information is actually quite restricted. But so it's very different from, obviously, from Rufinus. But I wonder to what extent maybe that shows that there is some kind of answer on Rufinus' part, or is there a connection between the two?
Yeah, thanks very much, Sabrina. That's a great question. So I guess to start with, one would have to we would have to accept that Rufinus would have been aware of the De Viris Illustribus, which I think it goes without saying he would have been. It's hard to say, but he was living about 6 miles from Jerome. Of course, they were really 6 million miles apart in some ways, but these texts, were at least readily available geographically to him. I like your idea that this could be some kind of response to what Jerome is doing. Of course, Jerome's also, there's the De Viris Illustribus classical tradition, right? We see that Jerome's, is modeling himself somewhat on that. But if Rufinus is possibly kind of responding somehow, it saw the HM as responding somehow, and be almost maybe a corrective to Jerome's.
Yes, and the definite appropriation of the Historia Ecclesiastica to cut the grass. I don't know what the expression in English, cut the grass behind Jerome's feet. I don't know, but Jerome, in the De Viris Illustribus, he starts monasticizing a little bit the characters, notably when he deals with the Therapeutae. It's much more monastic than it is in Eusebius, but he doesn't go very far with that at all.
Right, exactly. Yeah, and it just occurred to me too that Jerome did, I think it's in the preface to his Life of Hilarion, he did announce that he was working on his own church history. It's never, you can't ever tell with Jerome if it's pure bravado or if he actually was, but the fact he would announce it to readers tells us something. And if Rufinus is seeing something like this, maybe this is a way to kind of undercut him on that level. But yeah, to get back to your original thing, that somehow this idea that the Latin Rufinus's HM, it may be a response to kind of maybe literary one-upmanship even of Jerome. I think that's very interesting. And I mean, the case you can build circumstantially pretty easily because you have this documented rivalry between the two that was going on in the late 390s and early 400s, this very bitter rivalry. And even in more recent years, you could look to a comparison, we were mentioning Eusebius, that James Cork Webster and a few others over the years have argued that Athanasius' The Life of Antony, in fact,
Yes.
may be kind of a,
Yes.
you know, a response to Eusebius's program.
Yes.
So, you know, I mean, I think you may be onto something. It's a very intriguing idea. And
I think that a big difference between the two, which interested me when you were exposing it, is the fact that, you know, Rufinus insists so much that also he's a night witness, for example, something that Jerome cannot really do with dead authors, but at the same time, he does include living authors, something that is very different from Suetonius, for example. There are many, yeah, maybe contrasts to investigate, but that was just an idea.
yeah, thank you very much. Yeah. Well, let's talk more about this
Yeah,
in December.
we'll talk in December. Okay.
Yes.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Sabrina. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sabrina. Our next question is from Oded.
Hello.
Oded, just if you could unmute.
So yeah, Andy, thank you very much for this most illuminating paper. I have two short questions. One, you did not mention, and probably for a good reason of time span, the fact that John Cassian was in Egypt at the same time, a younger contemporary of Rufinus, as well as a member for some years on the Mount of Olives clan. And what were their connections apart from their similar interests? That's one question. The second question is, whilst the HM would be an original work, what's your stand on the ongoing debate about the HE being a plagiarization of Gelasius of Caesarea's work by Rufinus, hence not an original work, or at least in part not an original work?
Thank you very much. So yeah, the second question would probably take quite a bit of time to go over. So I won't say much except that yes, you are right. If in fact Rufinus did sort of quote unquote plagiarize some of this, so essentially the last two books of his own ecclesiastical history are not as original as we may have originally thought, then this in fact provides a very nice parallel to what he does in the HM. That and I don't think that that's necessarily alarming from an ancient standpoint. From a modern standpoint, if we tried to do something like this, you know, if you wrote an article and then you published it, and then I decided to publish it in another journal, well, that's academic misconduct, right? Because we just have very different standards.
I know.
Years
ago, a scholar wrote that plagiarizing and copying was the same thing in that period. So that wasn't that bad. And today we probably look at it very unethical, but they had different qualms about that.
Yeah, absolutely. And so it's difficult working on these authors sometimes because we have to remember that very thing. But I'm sorry, can you repeat your first question?
About John Cassian, how deep was their relations or their sort of cultural contacts or mutual interests in the Egyptian monastic world?
So the short answer is we don't really know anything for certain, but you're very right. All of these people are interacting with one another on one level or another, we think, or at least they're all in the same basic area. finding themselves in the Jerusalem area at some point. They also all have found themselves in monastic Egypt at various points, because that was, as you know, that was a very popular pilgrimage destination. So you go to Constantine's quote unquote Holy Land, but you know, the really devoted ascetics also go to monastic Egypt to kind of top off their trip. So we don't know that I'm aware of any certain evidence that can about you know, a connection between, say, Rufinus and Cassian. Again, they're overlapping in many ways.
Yeah.
Now, Cassian, of course, he goes back to Gaul and is doing his own very revolutionary thing, trying to spread Egyptian style monasticism, and is often credited with being the real kind of monastic propagandist.
Yeah.
I kind of see Rufinus as doing something similar, but in northern Italy, after he returns home. So he's spreading these Eastern, both Eastern in the sense of the quote unquote Holy Land, but also in Egypt, especially these types of ideas that simply didn't have currency in Italy at the time. Just like with Cassian, and I think Cassian was an extremely ambitious author. He knew what he was doing. He uses, his conferences, for instance, they're a very novel type of literary genre. So he's an enormously talented author, and I don't think is often given credit for that. But also as a monastic propagandist, I see him doing essentially the same thing that Rufinus is doing, but in a different context. But again, yeah, this is one of those questions. I love these types of questions. I can just imagine them sometimes. Maybe they sat down, had a fireside chat at some point, and shared their experiences. But I mean, we'll just never know. I don't think. But it was great. Great question.
It boils down to probability in this case.
What's
because
that?
It boils down to probability because they were in the same places at the same time, so to say. So they must have met or might have encountered each other's ideas or writings, perhaps.
Absolutely. And it may well be that Cassian, of course, he's writing later than Rufinus. Yeah. It may well be that he had the Latin HM in hand. And this was sort of an inspiration, it may have been one of the inspirations, not only to do his own thing, but also to engage in some literary rivalry. Because I think there was a lot of that going on at the time. The Greek HM, in fact, I argue in the book I published many years ago, that it was in fact a very deliberate attempt to undermine Athanasius's Life of Antony. On more than one, we have it documented that the author read it. So there's a lot of stuff going on here that initially, when you approach these authors, you think that they're out to edify people. They're great people, and they're they have the holiest and best and sincerest of intentions. But when you scratch beneath the surface, there's a lot of rivalry going on among these authors because they're all trying to promote their own unique vision of what edification really means.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
Our next question is from Theodore.
Hello, my name is Theodore. I also have two questions. Firstly, I'd like to know, did Rufin Aquileia said anything about the Second Ecumenical Council, maybe about first, or anything about heresies of that was on spot on discussion on these councils, because he lived in the same time with Second Ecumenical Council, and I think it was big and new phenomenon that he have to give it an attention for it.
Yeah, so you're talking about the 381 council.
In 381.
Yeah.
386, first
Yes.
year.
Yes, so he does mention it. So he takes his ecclesiastical history down to 395, and he will, especially towards the end of book 11, where he's winding everything down. He does talk about political events, but oftentimes as they're connected to theological controversies or what he thought of as the demise of paganism. Now, his main, if you want to, to boil down his theological orientation and his kind of his sensibilities in the ecclesiastical history, it's really very much an anti-Arian type thing. So, and he mentions Athanasius quite often in that context. So he's very much interested in that. He's actually more interested in that kind of development than really any other theological development. But
yes, thank you. And second, my question is, how rich is bibliography about Rufin Aquileia? Who had written about him, and whose researchers works could you advise?
I'll tell you what, email me. That's probably a better thing for email, and I can suggest some things. My email is ac@colorado.edu.
I will post it in the chat.
Okay, great. So yeah, email me and we'll go over that.
All right. Our next question is from Manu.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
So I was wondering when it was first discovered that there were additions by Rufinus in his Latin translation compared to the Greek. And it seems to me that the Greek must have had perhaps a more restricted circulation, because Jerome was clearly under the impression that this was a work of Rufinus because he only read it in the Latin.
Yeah, great question. So this is where Jerome's testimonium really becomes essential, because we don't have, it's really our earliest testimonium. In terms of manuscript, the codicological evidence, we simply don't, I mean, that we have to wait until the early Middle Ages to start seeing these attributions of the work to Rufinus, in the manuscripts. That simply is just a function of what manuscripts have survived. And Eva Schultz-Flügel, in her critical edition, I think she published it in 1992 of Rufinus's HM, goes into the textual history and establishes that. So, of course, all of these different manuscript families that are making this attribution to Rufinus presumably are going back to exemplars, right, from centuries earlier. It's really Jerome's testimonium that we're kind of pinning things on for the early, for the first about 15 years really after he produced the HM. And what makes it very complex when it comes to the Greek original is that throughout its transmission history, it was actually attributed to several people, one of whom was Jerome, which is a little ironic. And Jerome would have been rolling over in his grave with that because he was no fan of that work. But he was even credited as an author. But as far as we're able to trace it, the Greek was anonymous, and we think that Rufinus, the attribution of the Latin work to him were much more secure on, for the reasons I just gave. So.
Can I just... Could I just ask a clarification?
Sure, yeah.
Did I understand you correctly in saying that it was a monk at Rufinus's own monastery who had composed the Greek text?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
So then it wasn't anonymous. Rufinus knew who the composer of the Greek text was.
Right. He, of course, knew. He knew, and that's why I said
Right.
that it's interesting because he would have known. That makes it even more interesting that he would not have credited this monk with that when he translated the work. But yes, yeah,
And can you just tell me again when it was that the observation of the differences was made between the Latin editions and the Greek original? Who was it who first noticed that there was extra material in the Latin absent in the Greek?
So Caroline Bamel, or Hammond Bamel, I think is how she was going by at the time. I think it was back in the 1980s. There's an article of hers in which she discusses this. I believe she was the first to raise the question as to, noticing the differences between the two texts as we have them now, and interrogate why those differences were there. She arrived at a very different conclusion than I have. And she believed that the Greek text as we have it was not the original. It was essentially the product of scribes who were taking away things that may have been allusions to originistic teachings, that kind of thing. I argue this at length in print. I'm not convinced by that. But in terms of to get directly at your question, I believe she's the first modern scholar that I know of who pointed those out, those differences.
Thank you.
So our next question is from Darko, who asked me to read it because it doesn't have a microphone. So thank you for your talk. In the context of 4th century Trinitarian debates and regarding remarks in HM on God's invisibility, would you say that it is because the reference is to God the Father alone, or would you say God there references Trinity and so includes Christ too? Can it be used in assessing the general aniconism of those times before the appearance of the first genuine Christian icons?
I'm not really sure, to be honest. I'm not sure that we can really make that jump, right? I'm not really sure quite how to answer that. Yeah.
Okay, our next question is from David.
Thank you. Let me first of all apologize, Professor, because I'm not an academic. I'm coming at this from a pretty superficial level, but I was interested to know what you thought about a couple of ideas. He's sitting in Rufinus is sitting in Jerusalem. He's got the monastery, he's got Melania, he's got the money. Is he really competing with Jerome? He wants to be the authority rather than Jerome, who is also becoming quite well known. On that basis, I would also suggest, did he actually write all the translations himself? We know he wrote some of the works himself. Was he actually issuing works which his monks had done under his own name, which is something else that will probably be a lot more acceptable then than now, much the same way as Renaissance painters issued works carried out in their own workshops. If that were the case, then he would feel justified in issuing the anonymous monk's work under his own name, if that's what he was doing all the time. And if he were looking for authority, then the HM gives him all the authority he could want, because apparently in his own name, he was claiming something like apostolic authority when he was saying that I was chosen by these monks, these Egyptian monks, these saints. So you really should take account of what I say, never mind what Jerome says. Go with that.
Yeah, so that's a very interesting suggestion that Rufinus may not have been responsible for all of the translations that have come down under his name, that maybe some of his monks did that. It's an interesting idea. I mean, ultimately it's like so many questions that we grapple with. We just don't know. And actually, sometimes it's more fun to ask a lot of tough questions that we simply can't know, because that's what keeps this very interesting, doesn't it? I mean, if we could solve everything right away, I guess we would have much less to work with. But getting to your first comments about their rivalry, I believe that there was a very intense rivalry between Rufinus and Jerome, and to some extent, he was revving up his own literary engine, so to speak. So if you look at his timeline, why he's waiting until a specific period in his life to do this translation work. It could be a coincidence, but maybe not. The fact that he's doing all this stuff right around the time and after his pamphlet war with Jerome, which caused a lot of hard feelings on both sides of the Mediterranean. And those troubles followed Rufinus back to the West when he left for the West in 397. So was he trying to kind of keep up with Jerome on one level, or certainly, rival him? If you wind back to when they were both together in the Jerusalem area, while Jerome was in Bethlehem, about a few miles away, Rufinus is in Jerusalem on the Mount of Olives. When Paula and Jerome get to Bethlehem, so this is going to be, probably the spring of 386. They will have set down semi-permanent roots already by the end of that summer. Rufinus and Melania had already been established on the Mount of Olives for several years. So here you have one extremely wealthy Westerner who's very well connected to the imperial court, Melania, with a literary client, so to speak, a monastic client, Rufinus, who is a collaborator of hers. And now you have Jerome and Paula setting up essentially the same thing a few miles down the road. If that isn't, and of course there was rivalry between the two monasteries. They competed for donations, for one thing, which also could lead to more literary patronage, because they were both, thanks to Helena and Constantine, both of those areas had become revered pilgrim sites. So you have thousands of pilgrims coming through there on a yearly basis. And back then, it wasn't like now where, anybody could save up a little money and travel all over the world. But back then, you had to be extremely wealthy to be able to go on these pilgrimages. So nobody could ever convince me that Jerome and Paula are not trying to do some kind of rivalry here. When they're setting up in Bethlehem, they're doing it on purpose because it's already known as a specific site. So there's going to be rivalries that are going on there throughout the years on many levels. And to your suggestion, I think that maybe Rufinus's literary output may be a partial response to that.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. We have to round up. So please join me again in thanking Professor Andrew Cain for a wonderful talk. Thank you very much. So our next meeting will take place on November 23rd. Professor Walter Pohl of the University of Vienna will speak about Hans and Avars in the Eurasian context, and we will circulate the flyer soon. I wish to thank you for joining us today, and we hope to see you again in November. Bye, everyone.